Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks very much for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Happy to have you joining. I've been watching the chat there. See folks from a variety of locations all over the United States, of course, and I also saw a couple people, one from in France, Northern Ireland, and a variety of other locations around the world. So thank you, all of you, for taking time out of your schedule to join me for a topic that has been one of the longer standing topics, I would say. As many of you know, I, of course, am Tim Grey, and I've been publishing, many of you are aware, the Ask Tim Grey email newsletter for quite a while now. It's been over 20 years, going on 21 years, that I've been answering questions from photographers. And one of the topics that I suppose you could say just won't go away is resolution. And so I'm excited to have this presentation today. Happy to have you all join me. And part of the motivation here actually was the Ask Tim Grey email newsletter. In a few emails, you may recall, those of you that receive those daily emails, that there were some questions about resolution, and some certain topics from time to time bring up these follow-up questions. And sometimes those follow-up questions feel like they almost get a little bit out of hand. I get off on these tangents where several days in a row, sometimes, it seems like the entire week is focused on a single topic. And recently there were a variety of questions related to resolution. And it just reminded me what a persistent source of confusion this topic has been over the years and continues to be for photographers, and frankly, understandably so. And so, again, thanks for joining. I'm Tim Grey. I've been answering questions for a long time, of course, and producing video training courses, authoring books, all focused on helping photographers understand the tools and the techniques and the creativity in photography. And so today, again, focused on resolution. I do want to mention first, though, if you are a Lightroom Classic user and you haven't yet signed up, there are a couple of options available for video training on Lightroom Classic available through my GreyLearning website. There is, of course, the Ultimate Bundle, which I know many of you have signed up for so that you have access to all of the content that we publish on the GreyLearning website in the library there. There's also a focus on Lightroom in the Mastering Lightroom Classic Bundle, and one of the key courses is a relatively new one called Lightroom Lectures, which features long-form lectures. And in fact, this week and next week, I'll be back in the studio producing a significant amount of new content. So I'll be excited to announce that as soon as it is available. But without further ado, let's talk about the topic at hand, which is resolution confusion. More specifically, more importantly, solving resolution confusion. And so we're going to talk about some of the underlying concepts. Some of this may seem relatively simple. I know some of it is, in some respects, obvious once you've been a photographer for a little while, but I still think that revisiting these topics and maybe looking at them in a different light will help you better understand resolution and help you avoid confusion along the way. And for those of you who are signed in and are on board with the chat, I'm seeing there's yet more comments, greetings from all over the place, London and let's see, New York and Houston, Texas, Vancouver Island, beautiful area, Seattle, where I was for a period of time, Chicago, all sorts of locations represented there. If you've got questions along the way, feel free to put those into that chat, and Renee will be monitoring that and will get those questions to me so that I can address hopefully as many of those as possible, whichever questions may arise, or maybe there will be no questions at all because we'll solve that resolution confusion. So let's take a look first and foremost at resolution. It relates to pixels. So when we're talking about resolution, we're talking about pixels on some level. The pixels that are in our photos and essentially how we're presenting those pixels. And the actual way that we're presenting our pixels, our photographs, has a significant impact on how we need to think, or the way we need to think about resolution. And so resolution relates to pixels, but it can be described in a variety of different ways. And I think this is the core of where confusion comes from as it relates to resolution, is that resolution, simple concept, I suppose, but it can describe so many different things. And so resolution describes, for starters, the pixel count. We'll give you some examples of that here shortly. So how many pixels are there? It also relates to pixel density. So not just how many pixels, but how are they spread out? Are they pixels that are spread really far apart, or pixels that are squeezed really close together? And that'll have an impact on things like printing in particular, for example. We also use resolution to describe the image dimensions, which could take on a variety of different contexts depending on how we're displaying or sharing or working with our images. And also display quality, the overall quality of the image. This comes back to that notion of the pixels being spread out versus squeezed close together. The more spread out the pixels are, the lesser the quality. If you have a pixelated photo, it means that those pixels are relatively spread out for the area that we're trying to display them. Think of it as an enlargement that was made just way too big, and we don't have enough pixels for that. So the overall display quality relates to resolution. And also, where I think most photographers start to get more confused when it comes to resolution is when it comes time to printing. And once again, understandably so, because there are so many scenarios and so many ways we can describe resolution. And so, yes, I see Michael is commenting print resolution. That certainly is a factor. So print size and quality, which go hand in hand, essentially. And then another area, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later, is file size. Sometimes we'll use the file size for an image as something of a placeholder for resolution. And really, I think it's safe to say that resolution in general is really a placeholder for something. It's a fairly technical topic, meaning we're talking about technical details of our images, the way we're sharing our images, but it really is a placeholder for something we're trying to accomplish. Trying to accomplish a print of a particular size, or size an image appropriately for an online display on a blog or a web gallery of some sort, or to decide which camera to buy and to compare different cameras. And so part, again, of the confusion I think that comes from resolution is the simple fact that resolution can, in some respects, mean a variety of different things. It's sort of all one thing, but we can come at it from different angles. How many pixels are there? How are those pixels distributed? How can we distribute those pixels on a piece of paper to make a print or on a monitor display? And how do we communicate about resolution? And that can be problematic as well, as we'll see as I continue to talk about some of these finer points as it relates to resolution. But again, resolution relates to pixels. And so all of the various ways that we're thinking about or talking about resolution, it all comes down to the pixels in our photographs. And so what is a pixel? I imagine many of you are familiar with this assembly, as it were. Pixel is taken from picture element. So I suppose it should have been pickle, P-I-C-E-L, picture element. That, of course, maybe doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as pixel. And so they replaced the C in picture with an X to make it pix element. So a picture element, it is the individual component of a photograph. So each photograph, digital photograph that we capture, is comprised of pixels. Think of it as the smallest unit of measure for an image. Technically, I suppose you could say that's not exactly true because each pixel in our context as photographers has a red, a green, and a blue value. So there are those colors that are blended together to create the pixel, but we'll think of a pixel as the smallest unit of measure for a photo. So it might be represented something like this, a little red square on the screen. That's a pixel, let's say. Well then, how big is a pixel? This is a question I get fairly regularly, and the answer, I suppose you could say, is it's that big. Here's a blue pixel, and that's how big a pixel is. Well, how big? How big is that square, essentially? So I've got this little representation of a pixel on the screen. How big is it? For you, it might be a different size than it is for me. Some of you might be watching this presentation on your smartphone, for example, in which case that blue square is going to be fairly small, all things considered. Or you might be viewing this presentation on a very large display, in which case the pixel appears relatively large, all things considered. And so context really matters. And if I had to answer as simply as possible, how big is a pixel? I would say a pixel doesn't have a size. It's not entirely true, but for all intents and purposes, I don't think it's necessary to think of a pixel as having a particular size. It's just an individual component in a photo, that smallest element. Each pixel within the sky is going to look something like a bluish color, for example, and however many pixels wide our image happens to be, that's how many pixels we have. But we might display the image at different sizes on your big monitor display at home versus on your camera's little LCD display. That's presenting the same image, but at a larger or smaller size. And so the pixel, the individual elements that make up the photo, are being represented at different sizes. Well, let's actually consider some real world examples, scenarios of how big a pixel is. And I'll just use some examples. We'll just sort of randomly pick some devices here to talk about what the size of the pixel might be. And so using a mirrorless camera, this is a full frame 45 megapixel camera, for example. It happens to have just over 8,000 pixels across by about 5,500, give or take, pixels vertically. So we could do the math and figure out that that's about 45 million pixels. Well, if we know the size, the physical size of the image sensor, and a full frame sensor will be about 1 inch by 1.5 inches, and we know how many pixels we're talking about, we could do some simple math and find out that an individual pixel on this particular camera happens to be 0.000183 inches across. That's a tiny pixel. But of course, here the pixel is capturing information, an image circle that's projected through the lens. And so if the lens is projecting the world around us into a relatively small image circle, then of course we've taken that big world and projected it as a relatively small image, just big enough essentially for our image sensor. And so the individual pixel elements, the individual pixels, will be relatively small here, very, very small. And of course, depending on your camera, the size of the sensor and the overall resolution, the number of pixels across, for example, you could do your own math and figure out, just for academic purposes, I suppose, what the size of the pixel is. But point being is this is a small number, a very small number, a very small pixel. Well, then if we come to a monitor display, such as you might be using to view this presentation right now, then what is a pixel going to be? Well, once again, it depends. In many respects, I suppose the answer to how big is a pixel is, I don't know. But if you give me some more information, we can figure it out. And so here, for example, using a 27-inch 4K display, well, it has a width of about 23.5 inches and 4K representing 4,000. Most displays that are 4K, it's not really 4,000, it's somewhere in the 3,800 range. But the point is you do that math and you find out not quite as small a number, but an individual pixel on a what I would consider somewhat typical monitor display is going to be 0.006 inches across. Bigger. We're taking those same little tiny pixels that we captured with our camera and we're presenting them a little bit larger so that it can fill a little bit of a larger area on a relatively large high-resolution display, for example. And again, the specific numbers will vary based on the resolution of the display and the physical dimensions of that display. And then using the example of a print, which again, there's all sorts of different possibilities in terms of output size and output resolution. But if we assume, for example, an 11 by 17 inch print at a resolution of 300 pixels per inch, for example, in a typical print, we can say that the overall dimensions, and this is based on 300 pixels per inch, therefore, how many pixels fit in an inch? 300, at least 300 across, for example. So we do that math, and each of the individual pixels would be 0.003 inches across. So each pixel would actually be a little bit smaller than what we have on our monitor display, for example. We're presenting the information in a tighter package, you might say. But of course, this comes back to the real world for some of us, is when we're working with our images digitally. You know, in Photoshop, there isn't actually a size for a pixel. The pixel itself doesn't have a size. It's just information. Now we can display that information. So a 100% view, if you zoom to 100%, often referred to as actual pixels, then 1 pixel in the image is being presented by 1 pixel on your monitor display. How big will the image therefore appear? Not 100% of the print sample, just 100% in the context of how many pixels are in the image and how many pixels are in your monitor's display. And so once again, depending on the size of your display and the resolution of your display, that size for the image will be different. So if we, for example, just to pick some round numbers, let's say we had an image that is 2,000 pixels across, and many monitors run at a display resolution that's pretty close to 2,000 pixels, 1920 by 1080 pixels, for example. And so a 2,000 pixel wide image on a display that's around about 2,000 pixels wide, you could say that more or less the image fills the width of the display. If you take that exact same 2,000 pixel wide image and present it on a 4K display, then it's going to take up about half the width. So about 1/4 of the total area of the monitor display. And so what's the size of the pixel? It depends on context. What's the size of a pixel in the context of Photoshop? There is no size. It's just a pixel. And we can do all sorts of things with the pixels, and we can obviously change the appearance of the pixel, all of the pixels or any of the pixels, and then of course share that pixel, those pixels, in a variety of different ways. And that's when ultimately we're going to concern ourselves with resolution. How many pixels do we need for the intended output? And that's where some of the confusion really tends to get started. So counting pixels, if we consider the number of pixels, I mentioned that this is one of the ways that we talk about resolution. How many pixels do you have? And this relates to quantity of information. And the context where this tends to be most important to photographers is when they're capturing photos in the first place. So capturing a photo with a digital camera, how many pixels can the camera actually capture? And that in turn is going to determine how many pixels you have in your image, and therefore how large the image can be presented on a monitor display, in a print, whatever the case might be, in a huge billboard, for example. And so once again, returning to our example of a Canon EOS R5 mirrorless camera, this happens to be a 45 megapixel image sensor, or megapixel rating in terms of resolution, be 45 megapixels, which really just means 45 million pixels. So if we do the math of how many pixels across and how many pixels down, we would come up with, okay, not a precise number, it's not rounded exactly to 45 million, but it's very close to 45 million. And so 45 megapixels just means we have 45 million pixels to work with. If we had a camera with lower density of pixels, we might have a 24 megapixel, or we might have a camera with even more, 60 megapixels, for example, where we have even more information. Keep in mind that at least if we're talking about the same sensor size, obviously there's all sorts of variables in terms of camera equipment, but let's assume full frame sensors. And if we assume the same lens focal length, projecting an image onto that image sensor, when we have more pixels, it means we're dividing the image up into smaller pieces. We have greater resolution, to use the term. We have greater level of detail with more pixels for a smaller area, for the same size area. And so if we're taking a scene and photographing it, projecting with a particular lens, the more megapixels we have, the more information we have, in a manner of speaking, but really we're just dividing the world, the image, into smaller pieces. Now, because we're dividing it into smaller pieces, we have more pixels we can now enlarge, because when printing, for example, we might be printing typically, let's just assume for now, 300 pixels per inch. Well, if you have 5 million versus 10 million versus 50 million pixels, but you're always presenting those pixels at 300 pixels in an inch, then obviously the more pixels you have, the more inches you have, the larger the print can possibly be. And so as photographers, we concern ourselves with the number of pixels, because that is a placeholder for how big of an image do I have. Oversimplifying a little bit, it's a placeholder for how big can I print this image. And so the count method of describing resolution, the number of megapixels, is very commonly used, and I'm sure all of you are familiar. You probably know how many megapixels your camera has, or maybe you're dreaming of getting a camera with more megapixels so you can make larger prints, for example, but that is one way that we describe resolution. And of course, as I mentioned, with more pixels, we have more detail, and with more pixels, we can make a larger print, which is not the only motivation that we have as photographers, but it certainly is one of the motivations that we have. We want to be able to take a scene and produce a reasonable sized print, or for some of us, a very large print, the largest print possible. And that's where that resolution based on the number of pixels comes into play. On a monitor display, you could also count the number of pixels. And so, for example, this typical example, or what I would consider a somewhat typical example, this happens to be an 8.3 megapixel display. Perhaps this is the very first time you've ever heard a monitor described as having a resolution in megapixels. Why do we not ever talk about the number of megapixels in a monitor display? Because we don't. That's just not the way monitors have been marketed. Instead, it is typically a resolution in terms of how many pixels across by how many pixels down, down, for example. And so for this particular display, those numbers are 3840 by 2160. Maybe some of you, like me, are old enough to remember really old displays where you might have a resolution of 640 by 480 pixels or 1024 by 768. We've gotten increasing numbers in terms of resolution. I would say the typical monitor now in common use is probably 1080p resolution, so 1920 by 1080 pixels, but increasingly those are being replaced, and I'm sure many of you have upgraded to what's called a 4K display, maybe even an 8K display. So 4K, as in 4000, means that the display has approximately 4000 pixels across. In this case, you can see coming up slightly short, but this is a pretty typical number for a 4K display. 3840 pixels by 2160. So 3840 by 2160, simplifying that to just 4K. And so again, we usually describe the resolution not in terms of megapixels, even though we absolutely could, but just on pixel dimensions. And that's really just out of habit, you might say. It's because that's the way we've always done it. And so it's sort of, for those of us who have grown up with miles, kilometers seem confusing. Even though it's a very simple relationship, you can multiply the kilometers by 0.62 to find out how many miles it was. But still, I myself sometimes get confused when somebody describes a distance in kilometers. I need to translate it to miles for it to make sense to me, even though that shouldn't be necessary. And similarly, if I told you that a display was 8 megapixels, for most of you that probably doesn't really translate because that's not the way that we typically talk about resolution for monitor displays, even though it's a perfectly reasonable way to do it, even though it gives us some comparison, an easy comparison between, let's say, a 4 megapixel versus 8 megapixel display, for example. And then when it comes to Photoshop, I would say that the pixel dimensions so that we were using for that monitor display start to become less helpful. And in fact, I would even say that megapixels becomes less helpful because for most photographers, in my experience, you can't just automatically translate a number of megapixels to a print size. Maybe you've memorized, 24 megapixel gets you about an 8 by 10 print and that sort of thing. But we typically think of megapixels, the pixel count for the camera, and then pixel dimensions for the monitor display. Inside of Photoshop, neither of those really work. And so if you bring up the image size dialog, for example, here we have an image where you can see the width is 5,258 pixels. The height is 3,255 pixels. What does that mean? You'd have to do some math in your head. Even though those are pixels, and even though it makes sense in the context of a monitor display because we're accustomed to describing the display resolution in terms of pixels across and down, and even though you can see at the top we have an indication of the size of the image in megabytes, we'll talk about that a little bit later, even though we can calculate how many megapixels this image represents, that doesn't necessarily translate either. And so we need to have some way to describe the resolution with real world numbers that, while admittedly can add a little bit of confusion, it also adds a little bit of clarity, and it gives us a quicker way to understand what exactly we have in the context of the resolution for an image. And that's where we get to the pixel per inch resolution, which again can be a little misleading depending on context, but pixel per inch, or PPI, you might be familiar with DPI, or dots per inch resolution. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That was actually addressed in a recent Ask Tim Gray email newsletter where I suggested that for most of us, in many contexts, the terms pixel per inch, PPI, and dots per inch, DPI, are essentially interchangeable. They're historically used to describe different things, but the same concepts overall apply, with an important exception. So if we come back to our examples that I've been using here, our full frame mirrorless digital camera with a 45 megapixel sensor, and we know that being full frame, that sensor is about 1.5 inches by 1 inch. And so we can calculate the resolution, and this would be about 5,461 pixels per inch. That seems pretty good. Of course, we're talking about a very small inch. Okay, an inch is an inch, but here we're talking about the sensor size, and so we have very high resolution, but for a small image, you might say. So think of this as a 1.5 by 1 inch photographic print. It's a very small print, but it has exceptional detail and quality because we're printing at almost 5,500 pixels per inch. There isn't a printer that will do that for you, but conceptually it's a really nice idea. And so here again, the pixel per inch resolution, not exactly that meaningful. If we were always comparing everything based on pixels per inch, then that might be somewhat meaningful, but really in the context of a digital camera, again, we're interested in how many pixels, how much information are we gathering. A film scanner, remember these? I know some of you are still using these, digitizing some of your older captures. Maybe some of you are still capturing film captures as well. But a film scanner, which will typically give you somewhere in the 4,000 and up resolution range. This particular model has a 7,200 pixel per inch resolution, so it's able to scan your an original slide, for example, at over 7,000 pixels per inch, which, by the way, is greater density of information than the digital camera we were looking at previously. That was about 5,500 pixels per inch. This scanner goes to 7,200 pixels per inch. Of course, there's a catch, and that is that the film you're scanning really doesn't have that degree of resolution. There's not that much information in the original. How much information is there? That starts to get a lot more complicated, but generally speaking, slides, depending on the film stock, they're usually regarded as having the equivalent, even though they're not equivalent being analog versus digital, but something on the order of 4,000 pixels per inch or so. This also, by the way, represents almost 78 megapixels. So just to give us some translation in between all these different ways of talking about resolution, part of the reason it gets confusing, again, is that we have different ways of describing resolution, and we tend to use different ways depending on context, depending on what type of device or output we're talking about, for example. And then that monitor display, I'll bet many of you already know the answer to this question. What is the pixel per inch resolution of a monitor display? As I take a sip of coffee to give you the opportunity to perhaps shout out the wrong answer, that is often the wrong answer, 72 pixels per inch or 96 pixels per inch. And this is often described as 72 pixels per inch for Macintosh users and 96 pixels per inch for Windows users. No one has ever been able to explain to me why we would use different pixel per inch resolution on two different operating systems when we might be using the exact same monitor on both of those computers. This one, it's an old myth in the world of digital imaging. It's wrong. Displays are not 72 or 96 pixels per inch. Historically, there have been displays that were 72 or 96 pixels per inch, and I'll bet you probably could find a display today that is 72 or 96 pixels per inch. But what is the actual resolution of a typical display in the context of pixels per inch? Well, in this particular case, 163.47 pixels per inch. And most monitor displays today, I would say at the lower end, are typically around about 100 pixels per inch, and some are well up there into the 200 pixels per inch range. It depends, as always, on the physical dimensions of the display and the resolution. Now, keep in mind, in your operating system, you can run the display at different settings. You can effectively enlarge the elements by using a lower resolution, fewer pixels, and we can also make everything tiny by using more pixels to kind of shrink the display and then enlarge it over the size of the display. But that's a little bit different from the physical dimensions of the monitor in terms of pixels. So we can choose the resolution of the display. If you have a 4K display, you can still run it at somewhere around a 1080p resolution so that all the text elements appear larger, for example. And so adjusting the setting, think of that as a zoom setting effectively in your operating system for the display, but the actual native quality of the display is determined by how many pixels per inch the display contains. And so somewhere in the 100 or so, up to maybe as high as 200 is pretty typical. Anywhere in the 150-ish range is going to work out very nicely in terms of a nice crisp display. With a low resolution, things on the display start to look a little bit coarse, and with too high a resolution, the image might look great, but now many of the elements might be a little bit too small. The text will be too small to read, for example. And then taking a brief aside here in your web browser, sharing your images online. So here, my Instagram feed. If we pull that up in a web browser, what's the resolution of the images that are being displayed? Well, I suppose you could say conceptually that it is 163.47 pixels per inch because that's the resolution of the display that I happen to be looking at right now. But I would say that that also is wrong, and not technically wrong, just not really the way that we describe the resolution of the image itself, because we're actually in that context not going to be talking about pixel per inch resolution, but really just the display of the images, the number of pixels in the image. In effect, the pixel per inch or PPI resolution is irrelevant for online sharing. Because I've given you this example, my display at 160 and change pixels per inch, that's just my display. That's not your display. You might have a larger or smaller display. You might be operating at a higher or lower resolution. And so ultimately, the pixel per inch value is dependent on the end user. If your resolution is much higher, then the images might appear smaller. My resolution might be lower, so the images appear bigger. And so the pixel per inch resolution would be based on your display, not the images themselves. They're just a set number of pixels. Think of the more dramatic example would be a digital projector. What's the pixel per inch resolution of an online image? Well, if I project that web browser, for example, using a digital projector onto a huge screen, then I might have 10 pixels per inch, depending on how we're projecting and how large we're projecting. But that's not the actual resolution of the image itself. When we're sharing an image digitally, all we really need to know is what are the pixel dimensions, essentially. And you can't even really completely estimate what the image is going to look like for others because you don't know the size and resolution of their display. And so we use kind of just general values. In a blog post, for example, I might size an image to around about 600 or 800 pixels on the long edge because I know that's going to give me a reasonably good sized image across a variety of viewing conditions with different resolutions and monitor sizes, for example. But we don't have to worry about the pixel per inch resolution for sharing digitally. We just need to know how many pixels we need, the pixel dimensions, just like we know the pixel dimensions for our display resolution, for example. And then where pixel per inch resolution is really important, and in some respects I'd say the only context where it really matters is printing. And so when we're printing an image, we need to know ultimately not really the pixel per inch resolution per se. We need to know that we have enough pixels for the output that we're trying to produce. And so how large a print and what is the capabilities, the output size for the particular output. And so just to use some very rudimentary numbers, you'll recall earlier we saw an image that was 5,000 and change pixels by I think it was close to 3,000 pixels. When we resize in Photoshop, and you can see here at the center approximately of the screen, the resample checkbox is turned off, meaning I'm not resizing this image, I'm just changing the resolution. And so here's just a specific example from Photoshop. If we change the unit of measure, so the width and height here, I've changed, you can see on the right side, to inches instead of pixels. How many inches will this image be? Well, the number of inches depends upon the number of pixels per inch. And so if I have a 1,000 pixel wide image at 100 pixels per inch, that's 10 inches. At 300 pixels per inch, that's a little over 3 inches. And so the resolution, the pixel per inch resolution, determines how are we distributing the pixels that we have. We have a set number of pixels. How are we distributing them on the sheet of paper in the context of a print so that we're getting a particular size? And we can come at this from both directions. So here, not actually resizing the image, but simply changing the resolution setting to whatever our output might be. 300 pixels per inch is a pretty standard value for printing photos. At 300 pixels per inch, this image is approximately an 11 by 17 print. Can we make it bigger or smaller? Of course we can. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But just the native size of this image represents an 11 by 17 inch image printed at 300 pixels per inch. And so this is a way that we describe resolution for prints typically. And mostly it's a way of making the information easier to digest, like the kilometers versus miles example I gave earlier. If I tell you that the image is 5,000 by 3,000 pixels, you don't necessarily have an inherent sense of how big a print that is. Or if it's 24 megapixels or whatever the number might be, you don't necessarily translate that to a print size. But if we know that the capabilities of our printer enable us to print at, for example, 300 pixels per inch, then we can tell in two directions, we can tell some information. And so first and foremost, we can take the number of pixels we have divided by the pixels per inch, and now we know how many inches we end up with. So this image, for example, without any resizing, will print at approximately 11 by 17 inches. But we can also come at it from the other angle in terms of if I want to produce an 11 by 17 inch print, and I know my printer is printing at 300 pixels per inch, how many pixels do I need in the source image? And so we could do that math. Let's say it's, to make the math a little easier, 10 inch square at 300 pixels per inch. 10 by 300 is 3,000. I need the image to be 3,000 by 3,000 pixels to be able to produce an image that is printed 10 by 10 at 300 pixels per inch. More on the sizing of that a little bit later. First, a few questions here. And so, Mary Lou, good to see you online. Thanks for joining us. And how does a projector fit into this topic? I know I mentioned that a little bit earlier briefly, but think of a projector as a monitor display. It's, for all intents and purposes, the exact same concept. Things get a little bit trickier because we're projecting at a very large size, but the projector will indicate the resolution for the projector. Think of that as though it were a monitor. Just as we have a particular pixel dimension resolution for a monitor display, so too will we have that for a digital projector. The other piece that we need is the size of the physical display. And that is a big variable when it comes to a digital projector. On a monitor, it's a 27 inch or a 32 inch or whatever size display you happen to have. For a digital projector, the size of the screen is the size of the screen you're projecting onto, or the size of the image that you're projecting, which can be quite large. We measure our monitors in inches. The projected image is going to be measured in feet, sometimes a large number of feet across. And so same concept, but really ultimately, you're less concerned about the size of the projected image in that context and more interested in the pixel dimensions of the projector. So the projector has its own capabilities in terms of resolution. It is, just like your monitor, it has a maximum resolution in terms of the number of pixels across and down. And so after you've prepared an image that is large enough for that projector, the only other variable is how large are you projecting the image. And the larger you project the image, the larger everything's getting enlarged and spread out, and so the softer the image will appear. So all other things being equal, if you can project to a relatively small screen, that's better in terms of image quality. Of course, now it might be too small a screen for the audience to be able to see anything on that display. So that becomes obviously a little bit of a challenge as well. Yeah, and Richard, a good point, which I kind of touched on briefly in at least one of the contexts. So is pixels, so pixel resolution versus the realized resolution. So a camera with 4,000 by 6,000 pixels won't resolve 4,000 line pairs on a resolution chart. And likewise, as I mentioned for the scanner, he points out that for the same 7200 PPI scanner, you don't actually have that much information in the original. Very true. And so just to oversimplify just a little bit, just because your camera has X number of megapixels, if your camera has very high resolution, you effectively think of it as you need a lens with very good resolution as well. And that's typically indicated as line pairs per millimeter. And so, obviously there's some translation required there, but the bottom line is that in many cases, very high resolution cameras essentially exceed the resolution of most lenses. And so you're not really getting the full benefit of the resolution of the camera unless you're using the very best lenses. It's one of the reasons that macro lenses tend to be very popular among photographers who are very keen on having optimal image quality, optimal detail in their images. So a good nuanced question. George asked if megapixels doesn't mean better print, does it? Not necessarily. So the megapixels really are a measure of think of it as the native size of the print that you can produce. So here, for example, this was with I think it's a 24 megapixel camera. Don't quote me precisely on that, but pretty nearly so. This can produce about an 11 by 17 inch print. And so the resolution, the number of megapixels on the image sensor determines how many pixels. And since we're spreading those pixels out inch by inch at a set number, more on that shortly, more megapixels does mean bigger print. It also means more detail, as I mentioned earlier. That doesn't always indicate better print. We have to think about things such as noise levels, for example, overall image quality considerations. Is it in focus? Is the lens of adequate resolution? Are you getting chromatic aberrations? Noise levels that you're going to work with noise reduction software, but then that's going to soften up the image a little bit. So megapixels doesn't automatically translate. More megapixels doesn't automatically translate into a better quality print, but all other things being equal, it means a potentially larger print. Oh, and so recommendation about running a display at a moderately low resolution. So in this particular case, a 13-inch laptop display at 1920 by 1080 resolution, that's 1080p, at 150% scale because it makes the text and icons too large. Actually, in the case of a 13-inch display, totally agree. Usually we're dealing with the opposite problem. On a larger display with higher resolution, now all the text and the graphic elements, the interface elements within our software, for example, is really, really tiny, and it can be difficult to read and to see, and so running at a lower resolution. But for a 13-inch display, that's a relatively small display, and so that I would tend to run at a moderately high resolution. Mostly that's about what you're comfortable with in terms of those interface elements. All right, and so there are the pixel dimensions here once again, and that obviously translates into the resolution for printing. So if we're using a given printer, now I've been using so far 300 pixels per inch as my example because that is just a general printing standard. Most photo books, for example, most offset press printing, color offset press printing is done at 300 pixels per inch. And so that's just a sort of an industry standard that's been around for a long time. Many of you, I'm sure, are printing your own photos using a photo inkjet printer or some similar printer. And so you'll have a resolution there that is probably going to be higher. And so just to kind of translate to some of the different values, we've talked about the different ways that we describe resolution. And so this printer, I checked the specifications online, and that is a 4,800 pixel per inch printer. Wrong. I mean, not entirely wrong, but for our purposes, wrong. It is not 4,800 pixels per inch. It is 4,800 dots per inch. And really, I wouldn't even use the term dots per inch in this case. I wish printer manufacturers would not describe their printers in dots per inch, because as a very general rule, scanners are often described as having a resolution in dots per inch when I think it should be pixels per inch. I wish that it was more clear from printer manufacturers what the native resolution in terms of pixels actually was. Instead, they market the dots per inch, but they're not really talking about dots as we would make them roughly equal to pixels. Rather, the dots they're talking about are ink droplets. And it takes more than one ink droplet to make a pixel. In part because your printer probably has somewhere in the general range of around about 7 or so colors of ink, and you might have millions of possible, tens of millions of possible color values in your images, and so you can't use 7 colors of ink to produce millions of different colors unless you're mixing the inks together. And so for each pixel, we need several teeny tiny little droplets of ink all blended together in the perfect proportions to produce the right color, the right tonal value, for example, for each of our pixels, each of our when we're printing our image. And so the printer resolution that is advertised in the marketing materials, that represents ink droplets. I wish instead of calling it dots per inch, they would call it droplets per inch to help clarify. So that's just overall quality, and mostly that resolution, I would say, doesn't precisely translate to print quality. It does play a role, obviously. It really translates more to, I would say, color fidelity. The tinier the little droplets of ink, the more precisely, the more varied ways we can mix all of those inks together to produce a wide variety of different shades, hues, tones, and colors. And so that's still helpful. A very high resolution printer still gives us a benefit in the context of droplets of ink, but that doesn't describe for us how many pixels per inch or how many total pixels we need in the image to produce a print. This might make you assume, the marketing material saying 4,800 pixels per inch might make you think, remember the camera was, 5,500 pixels per inch, I believe? That means this printer can only reproduce an image that's around about the same size as your image sensor while maintaining good quality. That's obviously not true. So it's a very common point of confusion when we use that resolution in terms of droplets of ink to represent what we're more interested in as a very general sense, and in the pixel per inch resolution. And so depending on your printer, most printers, your mileage may vary, but most printers render the image data at 360 or 720 pixels per inch. A lot of dye sublimation printers were in the 400 or so pixel per inch range. And this is how it takes your source image and translate it essentially to the printed page. So if I'm printing at 360 pixels per inch, again, many more droplets of ink being used to create those pixels, but 360 pixels per inch, and I have an image that is 720 pixels across and down, then I have a 2-inch square image without any resizing, without interpolation. And so think of this, and this is obviously not something that gets communicated, but think of this as the real resolution of the printer. In other words, how is it rendering the image data and then using droplets of ink to create those pixels on the page. So most photo inkjet printers today, and I would say newer ones, are typically 720 pixel per inch in terms of rendering of the data. Earlier, the standard had been around 360 pixel per inch, but your mileage may vary, of course. And so that brings us back to the required resolution, which I addressed briefly a little bit earlier. And so the resolution of output determines the requirements. So knowing what that output is it 300 pixels per inch, 360 pixels per inch, 720 pixels per inch? Not that you need to exactly provide the number for 720 pixels per inch, for example, but the resolution of the output determines the requirements in terms of the image that you're printing. So for example, we'll assume 360 pixels per inch as the resolution for a typical inkjet printer. Many printers still rendering data at 360 pixels per inch. And so that means that if I'm going to create an 11 by 17 inch image. How many pixels do I need? Well, we come back to that shorthand. We can describe this. The reason we use pixel per inch in the first place is it makes it easier to describe in real-world terms. The pixel per inch resolution represents the capability of our printer, and then we translate that in the context of what size print do we want to produce. So we've already said 11 by 17. Well, I said I'm making an 11 by 17 inch print, and so my image data must be 11 by 17 inches at 360 pixels per inch, since that's the capability of my printer. How many pixels does that represent? Hold on, let me do the math here really quick in my head. No, I don't need to pretend to do the math in my head because it's right here in my presentation. For an 11 by 17 inch print at 360 pixels per inch, assuming I did the math right, that's 3,960 pixels by 6,120 pixels. That obviously is not as easy to communicate or as easy to understand as 11 by 17 at 360 pixels per inch. But ultimately, what it represents is the number of pixels. All we really need to know is how many pixels do we need in the output if we're talking about a 1-to-1 scale. In other words, to produce an 11 by 17 inch print with excellent quality, ideally, I want to start off with 11 by 17 or more of information. I don't want to come up short. And so I want to start off with the right amount of information, but talking about, 4,000 by 6,000 pixels, give or take, that's not quite as easy or clear or convenient as 11 by 17 inch print on a printer that renders data at 360 pixels per inch. That also, by the way, happens to translate to about 24.2 megapixels. So you can start to develop some rules of thumb knowing what sort of output you can produce. So if you've got a 24 megapixel image sensor, then you can produce an 11 by 17 inch print on a printer that renders at 360 pixels per inch, and you are now providing as many pixels as you need, assuming you haven't cropped, of course. But with that image, you're providing enough pixels to produce the output at that size with optimal quality. And that, by the way, is why many photographers, I mentioned cropping, this is why many photographers want a camera with much more resolution than they necessarily need, so that even after cropping the image from 45 megapixels down to 24 megapixels, for example, they still have enough pixels left over in the image after cropping to produce, for example, an 11 inch by 17 inch print. And so George, a really, really good question related to the resolution for printing. And I mentioned the 360 pixel per inch. Some printers now rendering at 720 pixels per inch. But he's using 360 because it's an even multiple of that printer resolution. Remember the 1440 or 2880 resolution, for example, you might be familiar with many printers. So the printer doesn't have to interpolate. I'll talk about interpolation in a moment. Is that an advantage, or am I kidding myself? And that depends on whether or not you're kidding yourself, depends on how exactly you're going about that. And so the key thing, first and foremost, is that you have enough information to produce the print size that you want based on the capabilities of the printer. Now, if you're setting the image to 360 pixels per inch, that's great. But if you started with not enough information, then that's not suddenly going to make a better print. Now, part of the reason that we want to prepare the image at the output resolution, meaning the rendering resolution of the printer, is so that we're not having to interpolate. So it's not a major issue, but it is a legitimate issue. It used to be a much bigger issue. If you, for example, if you prepare all of your images at 300 pixels per inch, but you're sending it to a printer that's rendering at 360 pixels per inch, the printer essentially is going to enlarge the image so that it has the right number of pixels. In the early days of photo inkjet printing, the printer software did not do a very good job of enlarging the image. And so you would see a dramatic difference, an improvement, if you enlarge the image in Photoshop so that you're sending the right amount of data to the printer rather than not sending enough data and having the printer interpolate the data anyway. In the early days, the printer software did a not very good job of rendering, and so there was a huge advantage to sending the data at the proper resolution and size, 360 pixels per inch, for example. That's much less of an issue now. Still, my personal preference is to do exactly that so that we don't have to essentially interpolate twice. We're resizing to exactly what the printer needs, and we're sending that data, the right amount of data, to the printer so that we're getting a good quality print without any additional work on the part of the printer. All right, and of course, we're talking about the capabilities, but really we can go further. So here we've talked about how many pixels or how many megapixels, the output needed, the dimensions needed to produce a print of, for example, 11 by 17, but that ignores interpolation. So we want to ideally start with as much information as we need, if not a little bit more. But if we come up a little bit short, so I gave the example, this particular camera that we were using as our example, or that particular image, had a native output size of 11 by 17 at, in that case, I was using 300 pixels per inch as my example. I can go beyond that. That's just the capabilities. That's the ideal. If you start with enough pixels or more than enough pixels, you're helping to ensure optimal print quality. But if you come up a little bit short, I'm not limited to an 11 by 17. I could make a 20 by 30 out of that image very easily and with very good quality. How far can we push things? It depends. As a very general rule, what I consider to be very reasonable for enlargement is doubling the dimensions. So double the width and double the height. So if we start off with this image, I can double it to this, which actually is 4 times the image area. So I can double the height and double the width. That gives me 4 times the total image area. So whatever you've started with in terms of the resolution, think of it as an uncropped image from your camera, could be an 11 by 17. Now we can make a 22 by 34, for example, which is 4 times the image area compared to what we started with. Could you go further? Absolutely. And in reality, the way I often answer this question in terms of how large can I enlarge the image, I say an infinite size as long as the viewer will be an adequate distance from the print. So if you're making a really huge print, 12 feet wide, but now people are sticking their noses right up to the print, it's not going to look spectacular. But as long as they're viewing from a reasonable distance, you can enlarge with abandon. I think it's still helpful to understand the overall dimensions that are necessary for a good quality print, but you absolutely can enlarge an image well beyond what it started as, easily 2x factor, easily double the height and width. But when push comes to shove, believe me, you can get much larger images as long as the original is of good quality. And then file size, so resolution to file size. So to give you just some rough rules of thumb, I guess this is trivia more than anything, but a raw capture, the number of megapixels, is going to be approximately equal to megabytes. So a 24 megapixel image, a 24 megapixel camera, I should say, will produce a raw capture file of approximately 24 megabytes. It's not always going to be anywhere near exact, and in many cases compression, whether it's lossless or lossy compression, might be applied. That will affect the file size. But as a very rough rule, number of megapixels is going to equal the number of megabytes for a raw capture. For an uncompressed flat TIFF image, the number of megapixels times 3 is going to be the number of megabytes because we've got a red, green, and blue channel. So 3 channels, 3 times the amount of information from a raw capture, assuming that we haven't compressed it and that we don't have layers in Photoshop and all those sorts of things. But again, just as a rough rule of thumb, a compressed image, so a JPEG, for example, it depends. It depends on the pixel dimensions. It depends on the image quality setting. It depends upon the contents of the image. The more complicated the image, the less effectively it will be compressed, and so it'll have a larger file size than a very simple image. A picture of a plain white wall, that will compress very nicely as a JPEG, whereas a very complicated image will not compress quite as well. But when it comes to file size, one of the key things to keep in mind is that file size can be meaningless. I often hear, for this photo contest, please submit a 5 megabyte JPEG image. Wrong. I get this all the time. It drives me crazy. And I tell photographers, ignore it. They want you to make sure that you don't have a file that's too large because they might have limitations on the server and they just don't want really large files clogging things up. But to target a file size with a JPEG image, it's very difficult. Even in Photoshop or in Lightroom Classic, for example, if you export an image from Lightroom Classic, you can set a target file size. I can pretty much guarantee you that the final file size will not match your target because it's just very difficult to calculate in advance without actually saving the image. It depends on pixel dimensions, it depends upon the image quality setting that you're using, and it depends on the contents of the image itself. And so I wish that every time someone says, send me a 5 megabyte file, just tell me the pixel dimensions. Tell me that you want a 2000 pixel on the long edge JPEG. And now the file size is going to be pretty moderate to begin with. We don't have to try and target a particular file size. File size is just unreliable when it comes to really any type of file. I gave some rules of thumb about raw captures and TIFF images, for example, but even there are so many variables, including compression and layers and embedded objects and all sorts of other things. Ultimately, it comes down to avoiding resolution confusion, hopefully. And I hope that my presentation today has helped to clarify some of those points. But some of the key things that I encourage you to try to keep in mind: more megapixels, all things being equal, represents larger output size. As I mentioned earlier in response to that question, it's not a guarantee. Just because you have more megapixels, if you capture an out of focus picture with 100 megapixels, it's still an out of focus picture. So you're not going to make a large print from that. But as long as it's a good quality image, more megapixels equals a larger output size. For a digital display, when you're sharing your images digitally, you only need to concern yourself with the actual pixel dimensions. And then when printing, you want the print size at a particular resolution based on the output capabilities for your printer. So I do want to say thank you right from the start. I know we've got a few questions here, so let me just take a look at some of the questions, and I'll address as many of these as I'm able. I know we're going slightly over time, but I'll take a couple of minutes here to address some of these questions. David asks, how do they make large pictures such as 4 feet by 6 feet? In a word, enlargement. Just as we can take an image, a slideshow presentation. So I'm looking at my own presentation on a monitor display. You're probably using a monitor display as well. But this presentation could have just as easily have been projected on a huge wall with a digital projector. And we're just enlarging the image. The quality won't hold up quite as well. If you get really close, you'll start to see that, diagonal lines start to look a little fuzzy and jagged, for example. But you can still produce that larger output. And so a 4 by 6 foot print, not outrageous. If you go stick your nose right up against that 4 by 6 foot print and compare it, hold with you the exact same image, one printed 8 by 10, the other printed 4 feet by 6 feet, and compare the quality, you'll notice a very clear difference if you're standing right up next to it. But by its nature, a 4 by 6 foot print, you're not usually sticking your nose against, you're usually stepping back a little bit so that you can take in the entirety of that image. And so quite simply, it's interpolation. It's taking the image and enlarging. It means essentially stretching the pixels out and inserting pixels in between, but software's gotten very sophisticated at being able to figure out those pixels in between. And yes, to Marilou's question here, if an image is slightly less than the printer requires, is it possible to maintain quality by very slightly adding pixels? I would say you don't even have to worry about the very slightly part. You could double the dimensions and you'll still get a very good quality print. So if you're just a little bit short, don't even hesitate to enlarge that image to give the printer what it needs to produce that output. Sue's question here, how good are the AI programs that increase resolution? I would say, in my experience, they're not as good as the marketing materials that accompany them. It's all just variations on a theme in terms of how we're calculating the in-between pixels. So I take, let's just assume there's, dividing, I've got an image that's half black, half white, literally divided down the middle, and I'm going to enlarge it. Well, in between, when I, stretch out these pixels, what do I put between the black and the white? Do I make it a middle gray? Do I make it black to match that side or white to match that side, or something in between? Do I mix them to varying degrees? And so there are various algorithms that have been in use over the years, some very impressive algorithms, and AI, artificial intelligence, is just attempting to make that even smarter. And essentially what AI brings to the equation is that instead of just having a formula where we take this pixel and we figure out what goes in between, AI is looking at the overall image and saying, okay, well, here, just as a fairly simplistic example, we have some text. We enlarge text in a very different way than we would enlarge photographic image data because the text needs to maintain that crispness, whereas the photo doesn't. We still want it to be sharp, but we can have a little bit more fuzziness in between. So there's no question that AI gives us an advantage in terms of having a variable effect on the image, targeting specific methods for enlarging an image based on the actual contents of the image. It is very good. It holds great promise, and so I expect it to be really fantastic in the future. For now, it's not a dramatically huge difference, but it can make a difference, and I do expect that that will be better. And yes, so Karen's question, you want to verify that when I submit a photo that requires a particular number of pixel dimensions, do I just go into Photoshop and resize to those specifications? Yes, make sure you're resizing a copy of your photo or that you don't save the original, but you could take your original, make a copy of it, and then just resize to the appropriate image dimensions, and that will work out perfectly. And Chris, I addressed this briefly earlier, but pixel per inch versus dot per inch, printing confusion. Pixels per inch represents the pixels in the image distributed over a number of inches. Dots per inch really relates to now the physical ink on the paper. And so, early on with printing that was closer to that type of scenario where it was actually a number of dots per inch of ink, then the separation made a little bit more sense. But now we're not really talking about dots per inch per se. We're talking about droplets of ink in the context of how the printer resolution is described. So that starts to get more confusing. And so in my mind, it should all just be pixels per inch. We scan it a set number of pixels per inch because we're creating pixels based on each inch of the original. We're printing pixels per inch because we're taking pixels and distributing them on the paper. Dots per inch is, I would say, a little bit of a misleading term in that context. And then Debbie asked about the size of the camera sensor. Where does that come into play? And I would say all other things being equal, size and resolution are related in the sense that the smaller the individual pixels, the greater the risk of noise on the sensor. Of course, nowadays we have some advanced technology helping to mitigate that noise, but there's still a little bit of a relationship there, as well as dynamic range for the image. And let's see, I'm not going to talk about resampling. The details of resampling we won't get into today. And resolution difference between TIFF and PSD? No. Photoshop document, a PSD file, it's actually a TIFF container. So think of a PSD and a TIFF file as variations on the exact same thing. Resolution will be dealt with in the exact same way. And Frank asks, is it a waste of time or space to prepare images for the web at greater than 72 pixels per inch? As I mentioned early on, 72 pixels per inch, that's a myth. Prepare the images based on an appropriate size for how they're going to be displayed. And so for something like a blog post where it's a relatively small image, something like 600 or 800 pixels across, the longer dimension works well. For sharing where you're a little bit more concerned about image quality, I'm usually creating an image that's larger, around about 1,500 to 2,000 pixels on the long end. All right. Yeah, and when talking about resizing, if you unlink the width and height, that enables you to stretch the image out, which sometimes can help you to avoid cropping to get just the right dimensions. But that also, if you stretch out a picture of me, now my face gets wider and it looks a little bit odd. So generally speaking, we would not want to unlink. All right. And yeah, this is a good question to end it on because it is a question I get very often, and that is, will there be a recording of the session? Yes, absolutely. And you'll be able to watch a recording of this session on my Tim Gray TV channel on YouTube at youtube.com/TimGrayTV. And so you can see recordings of all the previous webinars. This one will be there shortly after the live presentation here concludes. And we also have a course in the GreyLearning library. So if you're an Ultimate Bundle subscriber, we do publish all the webinar recordings in a GreyLearning webinars course that is available there as well. Oh, well, I said that was the last question. One last one. How do pixels relate to dynamic range? Just to oversimplify, the larger the pixels, the greater the dynamic range, because there's a bigger difference between empty and full. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it means, with a very, very high resolution camera, you are sacrificing a little bit with lower dynamic range and potentially higher noise levels. So do keep that in mind as well. All right. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining me. I do want to once again acknowledge you taking the time. Thank you for taking the time to join me for this presentation. I hope you found the information helpful. And again, if you want to learn more about using Lightroom Classic, mastering the use of Lightroom Classic in your workflow to organize, optimize, and share your photos, do check out my Mastering Lightroom Classic bundle at timgrey.me/LR bundle. Of course, all of the content available in that bundle is also available in my Ultimate bundle, the GreyLearning Ultimate bundle. So if you're interested in learning about other topics, photography, backing up your photos, cleaning up a mess in Lightroom Classic, getting organized, using Photoshop, photography itself, all sorts of great topics, Pixology magazine and more. Also be sure to check out the GreyLearning Ultimate bundle. All right, and we'll have another webinar presentation before too long. If you've got topics that you'd like to have covered, be sure to submit our contact form on the GreyLearning website or email me directly, and I'll be happy to consider some topics for future presentations. In the meantime, once again, thank you so much to all of you for joining me here today, and I'll hope to see you again soon in another presentation as part of the GreyLearning Live webinar series. Thank you all very much.